final session of the day for our conference, a stalwart band of survivors here for this Friday afternoon session. I'm Helen Taylor. I am an English professor here at LSUS. I'm also Associate Vice Chancellor, which you can decide which of those is more important. Our session is entitled Theory and Practice. Our first speaker is Dr. Max Skidmore from University of Missouri, Kansas City, who is going to talk to us about George McGovern, and we'll hold questions to the end of the session.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a minute first to comment on the fact that faculty members often find themselves unappreciated or feel unappreciated, even though we have a gracious style of living and we do what we love and so forth. But I should mention that the University of Missouri, I'm in that system, not on that campus, but the University of Missouri's main campus just recently has had a Nobel Prize winner. A professor of chemistry has shared the Nobel Prize, and the university acted with great dispatch to honor him. Now, if I'd only known, all I would have had to do would be to get a Nobel Prize, and I could have gotten my name on a bicycle rack. And that's not a joke. I mean, sadly. Anyway, my apologies for the cynical note there. In the presidential election of 1972, 20 minutes, the Democratic candidate, South Dakota Senator George McGovern, lost massively to President Richard Nixon, who was running successfully for re-election. For a time, his reputation joined with that of another great loser, Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, the 1964 Republican nominee, to influence the conventional wisdom. Republicans went the mantra, suffered a huge defeat in 1964, and Democrats in 1972 because they nominated extremist candidates. Well, as is too often true of the conventional wisdom, while it certainly is conventional, it may not be wise. The Republicans let it worry them hardly at all as they proceeded down the path of political extremism that culminated in today's chaos. The Democrats, as one might expect, reflecting the quip that liberals tend to be reluctant to support their own position in an argument, continue to have debates about the dangers of moving left and the comforting reassurance of centrism, perhaps even to the extent of advocating no labels. Any thoughtful analysis, though, now demonstrates that McGovern was never an extremist to begin with. Such an analysis, in fact, suggests that McGovern's legislative record was one of the most distinguished in the history of that august body, the United States Senate. That's especially the case, and I'm taking a very broad interpretation here, especially the case when one recognizes that an outstanding legislator not only sponsors and secures sound legislation or facilitates its passage, but also works to educate the public and to set an example and ultimately to bring about programs that have a beneficial effect domestically and worldwide. And insofar as the public retains a view of McGovernism, it has little or nothing to do with McGovern himself. During the 1972 political race, though, the term was quite familiar. I'm old enough to remember it well. As the Nixon campaign launched a vicious barrage of attacks against the Democratic nominee. George McGovern was un-American, unpatriotic, isolationist, a peacenik. But thoughtful political observers now recognize that McGovernism embraced values such as justice, equality, honesty in public service, and a willingness not only to fight for and lead such important and challenging causes as opposing war and abolishing hunger, but be willing to sacrifice one's political capital and career for a just cause. And I think it's appropriate to take a minute to digress here. McGovern was always anything but a fierce partisan. His record for reaching across the aisle is clear. What generally is not known is that in the 1976 election, being wary of a Southern governor he didn't know, and recognizing that however conservative Ford was, the sitting president was a decent person and a decent president, McGovern voted for Ford in 1976. Of course, he said he voted eagerly for Carter in 1980. Nobody was going to vote for Ronald Reagan. The reality of the peace-loving candidate, peace-advocating candidate of 1972 was actually a bona fide war hero. He was a former Methodist minister and a devoted father of 5. But McGovern rarely discussed his military record. He once remarked wistfully, I perhaps should have said something more about it, but it seemed unseemly to brag. He was a pilot in the Army, was clearly a war hero, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. One author put it matter-of-factly. McGovern flew 35 bombing missions over Europe. His plane was hit numerous times, but he managed to keep it in the air and land his crew safely after every bombing mission. Historian Stephen Ambrose was a friend of McGovern's, and he noted the B-24, the Liberator, that McGovern flew, was America's largest World War II aircraft until the debut of the B-29 Superfortress in 1944. The B-24 was huge and unwieldy. It was fast but slow to maneuver. It had no power assist or pressurization, taxing its pilots severely. The B-17 Flying Fortress, another 4-engine bomber that became far more famous, was easier to take off, easier to fly, easier to land, and had other advantages, such as it didn't break up or sink when it crash landed in the sea, which was a major advantage, actually, if you crash landed in the sea. But the B-24 exceeded the B-17 in speed, range, load capacity, and service ceiling. Ambrose wrote that it was, and I cringe when I read these words, but he probably would have rephrased it were he to write today. It was a man's airplane. It could be sternly unforgiving. It always required and sometimes demanded almost superhuman strength to fly. On a long mission, it could wear out even the strongest pilot. It also had a well-deserved reputation of being the hardest plane to fly. One pilot, Ambrose said, remarked, you could never trim the son of a gun and had to horse it around constantly. Because pilots steer with the left arm using the right for throttles and switches, the left arm received an exhausting workout. And I don't know if any of you are pilots, but any multi-engine aircraft is notoriously hard to handle when one of its engines fails. One joke about twin-engine planes is that they put a second engine on them because a twin engine flies so poorly with only one. There are, in fact, there have been twin-engine airplanes that can barely keep aloft with only one engine. And the B-24 was perhaps the worst of all. It was a 4-engine, large, very large monster. And McGovern once had an engine failure on a bombing mission, followed later by a second engine failure. Rather than returning immediately to base, which would have been authorized, he continued on to his mission, completed the mission, got back to safe territory, landed it safely and without mishap, although on a small island that was too small to take off again. So the plane was stuck there for the rest of the war, but the crew was safe and the mission was completed successfully. In another episode, a right tire blew out on takeoff. He could have turned around and come back. That too would have been authorized. But no, he continued on to his mission, completing it, making a perfect landing on return, holding the bright and damaged tire off the ground until the last second. Again, without a mishap. After the war, the McGoverns returned to South Dakota, began raising their family, which ultimately included 5 children. He graduated with honors from Dakota Wesleyan University, and the family moved to Illinois, where he enrolled in Garrett Theological Seminary. He also accepted simultaneous appointment as student minister at Diamond Lake Church, some 30 miles distant from Evanston, where the seminary was located. By 1947, though, he had decided against remaining in the military, enrolled in Northwestern University to pursue and achieve a PhD in history. The same year that he got his PhD, he became executive secretary of the South Dakota Democratic Party. I think the other 2 Democrats in the state elected him. His prospects for success seemed dismal. Generally, the state had been traditionally strongly Republican, and still is. But when he became a party official, the state's Senate consisted completely of Republicans. And its House had only 2 Democrats. So only 2 Democrats in the entire state legislature. The Democratic Party had no funds and little or nothing in the way of resources, and he had to generate enough to cover his own salary and to pay for travel expenses, and given the distances in South Dakota and the constant on the go that the duties required, his expenses were serious. But he did create an organization, the Century Club. People would donate $100 a year, and it remains the main funding for Democratic candidates, such as they are these days in South Dakota. McGovern's efforts at building a 2-party system were effective. In 1954, Democrats elected 6 members to the state Senate, 18 to the House. Republicans retained control, but they continued to gain, Democrats continued to gain because of McGovern's efforts. In 1956, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and re-elected in 1958. And from the beginning of his congressional career, he devoted considerable time to issues of hunger. Hunger, he says, is a political condition. And I completely agree. But regardless of his dedication to the cause, as a freshman representative, his power was minuscule. The only people in the House of Representatives with less power than the freshman representative of the majority party is the freshman representative of the minority party. Unfortunately for McGovern, he decided to, in 1960, to challenge the state's senior senator, Carl Munt. And Munt was a political fixture in South Dakota, and McGovern lost. Kennedy, however, won that year, and McGovern had been Chief Kennedy supporter in South Dakota. And as president, Kennedy appointed McGovern director of the Food for Peace program. And for almost 2 years, his 2 political passions were united as he expanded the program to use agricultural surpluses to feed the world and promote peace through non-military strategies. As director of the Food for Peace, acting on his own and pursuing an idea that he developed, he secured approval from the U.S. government for a $50 million grant in grain and cash to be matched by contributions from other countries to begin the World Food Program of the United Nations. The McGovern Initiative has become today the largest humanitarian feeding organization in the world. It reported in 2007 that it provided for 3.3 million tons of food to 86.1 million people in 80 different countries. By 1964, the children at the Food for Peace table numbered an impressive 1 million in Peru, 2 million in Korea, 3.5 million in Egypt, 4.5 million in Brazil, 9 million in India, and over 10 million in Southeast Asia. By the time he left the position, McGovern had coordinated the feeding of more hungry people than any other person in American history or world history. He had built the necessary institutional and political support for the program and recognized and reorganized and strengthened its structure and operation. Perhaps the greatest humanitarian accomplishment in the post-war era was George McGovern's accomplishment in food relief. He ran for the Senate, the other Senate seat in South Dakota, and in the course of the election, Francis Case, the sitting senator, died, so he was running for an open seat ultimately. He won narrowly. He took his seat in the Senate in January 1963 and began immediately to concentrate on his deep commitment in matters of agriculture and combating hunger. He also plunged into issues of war, becoming the first U.S. senator to issue a challenge on the floor of the Senate against the war in Vietnam. Now, it pained him to have to attack President Lyndon Johnson. Looking back on his anti-war leadership, he wrote in his autobiography, Grassroots, "I was filled with sadness and foreboding that this powerful, well-meaning man who wanted so desperately to be a great president was heading down the road to disaster." He had no such kind words for LBJ's successor, Richard Milhouse Nixon, who took office in January 1969 and became even more vigorous than LBJ in expanding the war. So in 1972, he achieved the Democratic nomination to challenge Richard Nixon for president. in a campaign noted for unscrupulous and unprecedented actions by his opponents in the Nixon administration, see Watergate, for example, McGovern went down to crushing defeat. As the new Democratic nominee, he selected a senator from Missouri, Thomas Eagleton. Eagleton was a charming guy, easy to talk to. Missouri Democrats loved him. Eleanor McGovern, though, has remarked scornfully of Eagleton's excessive, you might even say puppy-like, eagerness to accept the nomination during their telephone conversation with McGovern. Crawford. Eagleton himself was a liberal Democrat except on issues of abortion and prayer in the schools. On those issues, he, a committed Catholic, followed the teachings of his church, but that seemed to have little effect on the affection felt for him by his fellow Democrats in his state. What no one knew at the time, and what Eagleton certainly wasn't going to volunteer, was that he astonishingly had been the originator of the venomous jibe at McGovern for being the candidate of acid, amnesty, and abortion. Had McGovern and his campaign known when they vetted Eagleton, and vetting in those days was far more primitive, and it was more hit and miss than real vetting, as it has become later. But had they known, they would never have offered the vice presidential spot to Eagleton. But Eagleton also didn't volunteer when he was asked if he had any skeletons in his clothes. He said, no. Was the fact that he had received electroshock therapy for mental illness, extreme nervous exhaustion. And at that time, even more than today, you can imagine what Mr. Trump would do with that kind of record against an opponent. Mental illness was widely perceived as disqualifying. McGovern was sympathetic, and he tried to keep him on the ticket. But after a few days, he had to accept political reality and he had to request Eagleton to withdraw. Eagleton did so, but he was clearly unhappy, and he replaced him with Sergeant Schreiber, absolutely superb administrator and a Kennedy relative, but the damage had been done. Any chance McGovern had for victory, which was small to begin with, evaporated. What most likely would have been a normal defeat had turned into a complete rout. It didn't help that Eagleton sniped from the sidelines, continuing to make snide comments on and off the record. Despite his continuing popularity with Missouri Democrats, Eagleton behaved poorly. And he certainly did the Democrats no favor, thereby contributing to the Nixon victory. Following his presidential campaign, McGovern continued in the Senate, always concerning himself with peace and with feeding the hungry. He cooperated especially closely with Republican Senator Robert Dole, which was an achievement in itself, although Dole's reputation softened in later years. He was a fierce political partisan, known to many in his home state of Kansas as Mean Bob, known quite accurately to its fellows in Kansas as Mean Bob, I might say. Regardless, in those days, prior to the current polarized bitterness in Washington, even partisans such as Dole could and often did work across the aisle. Dole himself was motivated, as was McGovern, by humanitarian considerations, far too little in evidence today. But he supported food programs because of their benefits to recipients and also their benefits to farmers in the region. McGovern's great accomplishments were to improve programs to provide free or reduced price school lunches to children from low-income families, a tripling of the food stamp program to assist low-income Americans, the creation of the Women's Infants and Children program, the WIC program, to help meet the nutritional needs of low-income women who are pregnant or nursing and their children to the ages of 5, and the securing of an amendment to the National Defense Education Act to provide financial assistance to all college students, not merely those in the sciences. Oddly enough, he concluded that those in the humanities and social sciences needed to eat also. These measures improve the lives of thousands. Today, unfortunately, the attitude towards students tends to be not only far less favorable, but often actually punitive, with noted class bias evident. Throughout his career, McGovern fought tirelessly to create awareness of inadequacies in the quality of life of millions of his fellow citizens. and of their fellows throughout the world. He hoped to carry on this mission in the Senate, but failed in his bid to achieve a fourth term. He served 18 years as a Democratic senator from South Dakota. In 1980, the year Ronald Reagan's victory in the presidential election diverted American politics toward the extreme right. Once Reagan got the nomination, it was almost wiped from people's consciousness that he had previously, within a year of having received the nomination, represented the far right-wing extremist elements of the Republican Party. But the imprimatur of the party wiped out that recognition. McGovern lost his Senate seat that year to James Abnor. After leaving the Senate, as would have been expected, he remained enormously active. Dr. McGovern taught at numerous universities, spoke widely, and wrote prolifically, especially on matters relating to ending hunger and achieving world peace. In 1997, President Bill Clinton appointed McGovern ambassador to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He assumed the position in Rome in 1998, taking with him a plan to link improvements in nutrition with expansion of education, a plan that would also be a step toward improving the status of women in many areas of the world. And as an aside here, I'd like to say I'm finishing 10 years as editor of a scholarly journal, peer-reviewed quarterly, Poverty and Public Policy. And I'm stepping down as editor with the forthcoming issue. And one thing I quickly concluded, I was not a poverty scholar before that. I was asked to create the journal because of my work on Social Security and so forth, which was considered to be relevant. But very quickly it became evident, to me at any rate, that if there is a single greatest poverty cause of poverty in the world today, it's discrimination against women and subjugation of women wherever. And that is, I'm sorry to say, highly correlated with religious fundamentalism. And fundamentalisms of all kinds, not just religious, constitutional fundamentalism, political fundamentalism, economic fundamentalism, social fundamentalism, and I can define those at great length, but not in a short time with this newspaper. Skillfully using his status as ambassador and as former Democratic candidate for President of the United States, McGovern acted vigorously and on his own initiative, without clearing it with the State Department, or even at the White House, he proposed an international school lunch program. Characteristically, he sought the support of significant American political figures, both Democrats and Republicans, and again worked closely with former Republican Senator Robert Dole. By that time, he also was another former candidate for President of the United States. Dole and McGovern proposed that the United States work within the United Nations to ensure that every hungry child in the world would receive a nutritious lunch daily at school. By providing the lunch only at school, hungry families would be encouraged to send all their children to school, girls as well as boys. Many would begin to receive some education that they would not receive. Study after study indicates that just a few years of primary education will result in aggregate later marriage for girls, later pregnancies for girls, and better health and survivability outcomes, as well as quality of life issues. When George W. Bush became president, he removed McGovern from the ambassadorship. Nevertheless, Congress continued to support the program. And in an unprecedented move, the United Nations itself again placed McGovern in an ambassadorship. The UN appointed him an ambassador, which was, I don't know if that was unique or not, but it was certainly unusual. In 2001, its food program came under McGovern's control as ambassador to that organization. He was named its global ambassador on hunger. Throughout his life, right up to his death in 2012, at the age of 90, he avoided harsh language, but he did condemn the younger Bush for killing progressive programs while spending lavishly on the military and cutting taxes for the rich. And hearkening back to the Social Security paper, you will find, if you look, you don't have to look that carefully, you find a consistent pattern. It began in the Reagan administration. You proposed huge tax cuts, asserting authoritatively that they will be revenue neutral. They will not. They will pay for themselves. When they don't, inevitably, the deficits go up, and then they say, "Oh, now we don't rescind the tax cuts. We have to attack Social Security and Medicare and programs that feed and help you." It happened under Reagan. It happened under George W. Tax cuts so deficits go up, and it serves as a basis for starving the beast and attacking so-called entitlements. And it now is happening under the current occupant of the White what's his name? In 2008, Robert Dole and George McGovern became food laureates. They were jointly awarded the World Food Prize. Some have called that $250,000 prize the Nobel Prize for Food and Agriculture. Bob Watson of Lynn University and I, before McGovern's death, nominated him as professors of social science. We were authorized to nominate things. Only that one. You can't nominate a literature laureate or any of the others, but Nobel Peace Prize you can. And our timing was not good. It came the year after Barack Obama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's unusual. It's happened, but it's not often that two people from the same country are awarded the prize in successive years. So it got nowhere, but we were honored to have done that. The award announcement for the food prize called Dole and McGovern and cited their collaborative efforts to feed the world's hungry, and most especially girls. Called it one of the greatest achievements in ending hunger ever. Millions of the world's children that otherwise would have starved or at least been severely malnourished or not. In addition, they were active in spreading education. Now, although most of those who think about McGovern today recognize his essential decency and his thoughtful approaches to government, those who think about him now, in fact, at all, are too few. But some of those who do are conservatives or libertarians, ironically. Camilo Gomez, for example, writes in Counterpunch, almost 3 years from the day that George McGovern passed away, there had been very few debates over the legacy of the liberal icon. Curiously, it was the American conservative writers, that's the magazine, like Daniel McCarthy and Bill Kaufman, who presented a fair and respectful analysis of his career, the present value of his ideas, and even his unexpected conservatism. George McGovern, he says, and this is a direct quote, was one of the most decent politicians in recent history. He was a man of deep conviction. He was a liberal in the best sense of the word, but not the worst. He managed to appeal to the conservative sensibilities of a middle America forgotten by both his liberal supporters and the anti-McGovernite conservatives. While he wasn't successful, his cause is good enough to be defended. And as for the journal mentioned above, the American Conservative, Bill Kaufman titles his article, "Come Home America, Liberals Need Another George McGovern. Perhaps conservatives do too." After analyzing and paying tribute to McGovern's career and programs, Kaufman concludes that what is needed is a bracing shot of McGovernism. Now, one should note that all those comments came, and many, many others in the same vein, came considerably before anyone thought of a Donald Trump on the horizon. So, especially if outstanding legislative leadership is considered to be more than merely supporting legislative acts, George McGovern's role as a great American leader in Congress, for the people and ultimately for the world, I submit qualifies him to be listed among the best, especially for a conference